My name is Baso from the UJ Center for Africa-China Studies, and we will soon be getting started with this seminar meant to celebrate an intellectual giant of the continent who has sadly departed recently. I'd like to take this time to also acknowledge the presence of his family as represented by his son, Joshua. I would like now to hand over to Mrs. Elinor Sisulu. Mrs. Sisulu is a Zimbabwean-born South African writer and human rights activist who combines training in history, English literature, development studies, feminist theory from institutions in Zimbabwe, Senegal, and the Netherlands. She's an award-winning author of two books, The Day Gogo Went to Vote, and the biography of her parents-in-law, Walter and Albertina Sisulu, in our lifetime. She is a founder, member, and former chairperson and executive director of the Pugu Children's Literature Foundation, a project that aims to improve the quality and quantity of children's books in all South African languages. Concerned with the deterioration in the human rights situation in Zimbabwe, Mrs. Sisulu spearheaded the establishment of the Johannesburg office of the Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition, which ran from 2004 to 2009, developing it in the process into a hub for regional and international solidarity initiatives to promote democracy, peace, and justice in Zimbabwe. Mrs. Sisulu has served on a non-executive director basis of numerous boards, including the Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa and the National Arts Festival. Mrs. Sisulu, we're honored to have you. Please chair the session.
Thank you very much. I was actually just about to cut that long introduction, but thank you. And I just want to acknowledge my husband, Max, who is with us this afternoon as well. And thank you to your institute, Baso, for arranging for this auspicious occasion. It's quite a surreal time for all of us. And we are reminded of this every time we lose someone, and particularly someone of the stature of Thandika Mkandawire. I would like to start by acknowledging his family members who are here. I see Joshua. It would be wonderful, Joshua, if we could just see your face, even just for a few minutes. And that's Thandika's second son. And then we also have Pat Mohone, one of the elders in the family. So welcome, Pat. I don't see anyone else here. Maybe they would acknowledge Joshua. Oh, I thought that was Andre. The resemblance is quite remarkable. I don't know if there are any other members of the family, Thandika's immediate and extended family. We welcome you and of course express our condolences. We certainly, in normal times, Thandika would have had a very huge funeral and you would have seen some of us there. But since that is not the case, we make use of this platform and we'll try and do the best we can. So I have the honor of chairing this, I think, by virtue of long friendship with Thandika and his family. I was a young student in Dakar in 1980. I'm revealing my age here, when I think Joshua was a baby at the time. So that's a long time ago. And that's when I met Thandika. And he and his wife, Barbara, at the time opened their houses and welcomed all the scholars from Southern Africa. So their house was like a Southern Africa social center. And we were mentored both in the life of trying to survive in Dakar, a place which we weren't used to, and as well as the intellectual mentorship that we got from Thandika, which we appreciated very much. So it's I think, a very healing process for us to be able to meet today and reflect on his life, his intellectual contribution especially. I'm not going to talk too much about that, except maybe just point out a few things of his influence on me. One of the things, apart from being a great scholar that people have talked about, Thandika loved people very much. He loved people from all walks of life, race, class, religious, ethnic background. He always spoke about being a minority of minorities. As a Zimbabwean whose mother was Ndebele and father was Malawian, he said he was always in the minority wherever he went. So in Zimbabwe, it was a double minority, Ndebele, Malawian. When his family went to Zambia, they were a minority as migrant laborers. When they went to Malawi, he was from the Mtubuka clan, so that was a minority in Malawi. And I think it made him very sensitive to human rights and the rights of everyone. He was a Pan-Africanist who loved Africa, and conversely, he hated repression of African states. And personally, I learned from him, and I think I was influenced by him to become a human rights activist. There was one story particularly that I would like to relate. There's many, many stories that Thandika told that we would be here for days recounting them, but there's one particular one. He spoke about the thief who was caught by a crowd in Senegal. The thief in Dakar, they did a citizen's arrest, the crowd that caught him. And the thief, then a gendarme came, and the gendarme was about to arrest him. And then this thief argued and said, no, you are a gendarme. You're responsible for state security. You cannot arrest me. I'm just a common thief. So it's the police who are responsible for a crime. You can't, as a gendarme, arrest me. And the crowd listened to this, and they held him while someone went to look for the rights policeman to come and arrest him. And of course, the Southern Africans listening to the story laughed, because in Southern Africa, we know what would have happened. The thief would have probably been beaten and would have been lucky to escape with his life, and would not be able to argue the finer points of the law and the mandate of the person who's arresting him. And I think that Thandika was very, very sensitive to issues of people's rights, and especially the marginalized and the most materially deprived. And that really informed how he looked. So his intellectualism was really informed by a very deep love of the continent and the people of the continent, and hatred of repression. And we are experiencing in this continent now, with all these lockdowns, a state apparatus around the continent that are really abusing people in the process, supposedly to protect them. And that's why we need voices like Thandika's. And I hope that his influence will live long after him. I would like to invite Professor Khadiagala, who is international relations professor at WITS, as an expert on United States policy. I hope this is correct, Professor. If I haven't described you properly, you will correct me. We had occasion to share a platform a couple of years ago at the South African Book Fair, which was a very interesting discussion. And so I welcome you to give your account of Thandika, his influence and his voice, and maybe how we can make his voice live on after his physical passing.
Thank you very much, Elna. And I really want to thank David and Basil and the Institute for this opportunity to participate in this very important event that is commemorating the legacy of Thandika Mkandawire. I think I have to say from the outset that, first of all, I'm a professor at Wits University in Johannesburg, for those people who don't know me. I didn't know Thandika very well. I didn't work for Codestria, neither had I any affiliation with Codestria for most of my academic life. And I also didn't have any affiliation with the Institute in Geneva, where he worked also for quite a long time. But I know Mkandawire very well from his writings. For many years, I was teaching a class called Ideas in Development, which was looking at global production of ideas and the thinkers behind these ideas. And Thandika was very much a part of that class, which I taught for about 15 years or so. And at Wits University, I've been teaching a class, a similar class on development issues in international relations. And I've also used his work very profusely. And I want to say from the outset also that my students have benefited tremendously from having an African scholar as part of that class. And that is why I want to speak about his contribution to African ideas. So I feel that through my teaching, I know him fairly well. And of course, I met him here and there. But I want to say from the beginning, therefore, that as we appreciate the works of Thandika, I think we need a framework that is going to allow us to understand his ideas. And so I think what I want to do is to spend some time in laying that framework so that as we read his works, it makes more sense to us. My understanding of political thought, because my topic today is Mkandawire's political thought, is that in fact political thought is about ideas around the world, reflections, musings about what the world is all about. And I think political thought is almost always descriptive and sometimes very prescriptive. So we have that sense of what political ideas are. On the basis of this definition of political thought, therefore, what I want to suggest here is that Thandika's ideas are divided, or they could be appreciated through three big components. And the first component is what I say is that his ideas have an inner coherence to them. And that inner coherence is important because it tells us very clearly that his ideas were not sporadic, his ideas were not episodic, neither were they pedestrian. So the coherence is important, I think, to begin to appreciate his contribution to political ideas. The inner coherence speaks or accrues from a systematic and a logical understanding of the world. I think that's what I'm calling the inner coherence of his ideas. A very systematic and logical understanding of the world. The second component is to argue that powerful ideas such as those that Thandika Mkandawire gave us had a consistency to them. Consistency to me is very critical in thinking because it reinforces my earlier idea about coherent patterns of thinking, coherent ideas. So by consistency, I'm thinking about a sequential pattern that builds on some foundational ideas. But even as these ideas evolve, they remain anchored on a very core foundation. So that's what I'll be saying, that Thandika had very consistent ideas because these ideas evolved from a very core foundation. And even as he went through various stages of iteration of these ideas, they remain pretty much consistent. So I'll be arguing here that he never saw the temptation to be captured by prevailing intellectual facts. He never saw the temptation of being captured by paradigms. And he resisted the temptation, therefore, of jumping from one school to the other. as most of us do. He used paradigms very creatively, but he didn't want to be a prisoner of those paradigms. And I think that's an important element as I bring up the issue around consistency and coherence, is to say that there is a clear pattern to them that is discernible throughout his years as a thinker. Finally, I propose that inner coherence and the consistency of the ideas, we should also add the other important component of his ideas, which is conviction. A lot of us have ideas, but we never really can mobilize the energy to lend them the conviction that make them attractive. I think Thandika's ideas had the conviction around them because he was able to forcefully articulate these ideas. And once he forcefully articulated these ideas, he was able, therefore, to convince. He was able to be listened to. He was able to be heard because there was some seriousness to the way he articulated these ideas. So I think conviction is important in political thought because the writings are powerful. They arise from the very sense that the person who is speaking these ideas is serious. Convictions are also about the intellectual gravitas that Thandika was able to lend to his ideas. And that's why I'm arguing that it's important to begin to look at his ideas as ideas anchored on very strong authoritative ideas that he was able to provide. So with those three C's, therefore, coherence, consistency, and conviction, how do I begin to look at the content of Mkandawire thought? And I'm not going to go too much into the content issues. I'm just saying the framework gives us at least a working framework in understanding all the corpus of his ideas. And I'm writing a big journal article on these issues. So this gives me the first audience actually to begin to present some of these ideas. I think as we look at the issues of content, we should start from the premise that as an intellectual, Thandika was a modest man. He was too modest to claim that he had original ideas. He was an original thinker. In fact, he would be the first person to have stated that there are really no new ideas out there. And I think that's the element of modesty that I'm trying to push here. He was not claiming that he was going to produce original ideas. But the mark of a thinker like him is not the originality of these ideas, but rather what I'm calling here the interpretive clarity. The interpretive clarity that he lent to these ideas. And this is what I'm calling Mkandawire as a lucid interpreter of prevailing ideas. And I think that's a bigger mark that I'm putting across. You don't need new ideas, you just need to interpret existing ideas more lucidly. He made these ideas more explicit. He also made them more explicable, if I could use that word. But you cannot be a lucid interpreter if you do not think clearly. Therefore, one of my suggestions here is what made it possible for Mkandawire to have these clear ideas, lucid interpretation, was that he was a clear thinker himself. And it is important to put that on the table, that you can't really think clearly. I mean, you can't have serious ideas if you are not thinking clearly. I think that's an important component, therefore, that he could think clearly and interpret these ideas to larger audiences, as I said, in a much more authoritative way than some of us actually can do it. So I think I want to say here also on the content issue, the core of Mkandawire's ideas, I think, were the belief that there were universal principles that helped to explain the world. However, these universal principles had to be continuously negotiated within the particulars, within the specific context of our own region. I think that's why if you read most of his work, he's talking about we should take history very seriously. The question, therefore, is that this is a believer in some universal laws or universal principles that govern the world. But ultimately, we need to understand these universals within the larger context of how do they speak to our particular concerns. And it is this issue of reconciling the universal and the particular that enabled him to weather the paradigmatic pendulum swings that were witnessed in African scholarship since the 60s, from modernization to dependency, to postmodernism, to structuralism, to decolonial. These are paradigms that actually he did acknowledge, but he was never a prisoner of any of these paradigms because of the abiding truth that, in fact, you need to reconcile the universals with the particulars. And I think that's why I'm saying that his work is important. In reconciling the universal and the particular, therefore, he was enabled to lend interpretation to the momentous scholarly and policy debates, beginning from the development economics debates of the 60s into the structural adjustment debates of the 80s and 90s, into the post-Washington consensus ideas. So he positioned himself within these broader debates about African development from a vantage point that, in fact, we needed to remain consistent, that knowledge production was about how you reconcile the broader issues around the universals and how you negotiate them within the particulars. I think we know him very well for the critique of the structural adjustment policies and the role of international experts in African development. And I think this is where he was able to lend a lot of intellectual efforts through Codestria, where I think from my reading of the works on Codestria, he was able to mobilize his energies in the production of critical thinking about the structural adjustment policies within Africa and their impact in Africa. But I also like the element about Codestria because it was an attempt to create a critical mass of African scholars who could spearhead the continental thinking about these bigger issues of the day, particularly the role of international actors in African development. He argues, therefore, that in the context where African scholars were struggling with repression at home and marginalization abroad, it was important to have a space, a continental space where they could do the thinking. And I think that is the significance to me of his position as Codestria, where he was using as a vantage point of what you call institutional thinking around the issues that needed to be articulated on African development. So I take that as a critical contribution. The other critical moment where Thandika was to shine was on the reflection on the state and development. And this is captured in his essay on the developmental state in Africa. And when I was doing the reading, I saw that this essay was published in 2001, in the Cambridge Journal of Economics, but actually he began to articulate these ideas in 1995 at a conference, the General Assembly conference at Codestria, where he was beginning to argue that in fact, contrary to the then existing wisdom, we needed to begin to look at development and democracy as going hand in hand, rejecting, in fact, the pessimism that development was impossible in Africa, but also rejecting what was becoming the triumphalism around developmental dictatorships. So this is to me one of the powerful essays, and most of my students have found this quite significant in understanding the current debate about the role of the state in the economy, really appreciating the democracy and development are of intrinsic value and therefore needed to be pursued together. Through this essay, we also see Thandika doing what he had done from the 60s, injecting African voices in global debates, where it was significant because he did appreciate the asymmetries in power between Africa and the rest of the world, but still believed that in fact, despite those asymmetries, we could have consistent African voices that challenges or brings African voices to the global horizon. So I'm beginning to say, therefore, that this is an important contribution, because what he's doing is that he's appropriating the language of universalism, in fact, to begin to challenge those who are beginning to look at Africa as a basket case. Let me say, therefore, to conclude, and I just want to conclude quickly because, as I said, these are preliminary remarks that I'm teasing as I write my essay. I think the first point is that Thandika was a very strong believer in African institutions. Most of us become very pessimistic about African institutions, but he was consistently optimistic that, in fact, we needed strong states in Africa that were both developmental, but they're also both democratic, so that we could, in fact, use our own institutions for our own agency. And I think that's an important element. Where others were throwing all kinds of names to the African state, he cautioned against this cheapness of name creation, name calling of African states. He said we need to take them seriously because they are going to be important to resolve our problems. He also believed in the role of the African Academy. And I think most of his writing are on the role of social sciences in Africa. I see a very consistent voice about if we don't have our own indigenous thinkers who also understand the language of the North, we are actually not going to get anywhere. So the issue around African knowledge production is important in Mkandawire's political ideas. And I see that, therefore, as part of the broader theories around African agency that we are all grappling with. How do we create better African scholarship that actually responds to African needs while not being too defensive? And I think that is the larger contribution that I'm saying, the faith in African institutions, in African agency, and therefore in our ability to overcome some of these bigger problems that we confront. Let me stop here, and I may take some other questions on some of the content issues, but I thought I would just put that as my 2 cents on Mkandawire.
Thank you very much, Professor. You've raised a lot of very interesting and insightful points. I think that the issue, while you were talking, I was feeling glad that at least Mkandawire is on some of the bibliographies in the universities. When the students a couple of years ago were talking about demanding from government a decolonized education, I did think of Codestria, all the work that Thandika had done, all the African scholars with whom he was associated, thinking of people like Archie Mafeje, Guy Muhoni, and many others, that these people don't feature, that in South Africa people don't read these scholars. So I'm really happy to know at least some students are getting a good decolonized education. And, you know, talking about decolonization, who better to bring on next than Dr. Ibbo Mandaza, my own relative, who many years ago forced me against my will. I was working in Ministry of Labor in Zimbabwe, and he was a permanent secretary. And he sent some of us to Nigeria and to Senegal. And I didn't want to go. And in the typical Igbo fashion, he said, no, you have to go. And that was it. I must thank him for a huge part of my education. I think going to Senegal was really, if I can claim myself to be a decolonized being, that was a major part of it. So I'll hand over to you, Ibbo.
Thanks, Elinor. Thanks very much. And I also want to begin by acknowledging the importance of this program, and to thank UJ and David Monyai in particular for putting us together in this forum to honor Thandika Mkandawire. I think the last few weeks since Thandika departed, it has been a very heartening experience to see the entire continent and its diaspora really responding in the manner in which the UJ itself is responding today. And I'd like to acknowledge, of course, Joshua. Nice to see you after so many, after the long way. But also to see some of the old hands in the African struggle, academic struggle, intellectual struggle. Nuruddin, how are you? And my older brother, Molly, and my sister-in-law, Joanna. Nice to see you, and Pat Mohone, and many others were Karuti in Kenya. They've been asking for the link and got it from my son here. So, and Gilbert, of course, nice to see you after a long time. Yes. I was one of those who wrote very quickly the tribute to Thandika the day after he died. So I think that is on record, so I don't have to go too extensively, and so I'll certainly limit myself maybe 10 minutes, and doing so just to highlight three things. First is, of course, the intellectual giant that Thandika was. And Gilbert has done a good job. He spoke of coherence, consistency, and conviction. All very true about Thandika. But many of you will have seen the tributes to Thandika on this platform called Homage to Thandika Mkandawire, which Codestria has been driving. And just today I received my own tribute, a copy of thereof, with the request that we all, those who have done tribute to Thandika, and I'm sure Gilbert, yours will be most welcome, that there will be a book very soon on Thandika in that regard. And in addition to the detailed account on Thandika's intellectual history, there's a beautiful piece by Yusuf Bangura, one of our leading intellectuals. He has done a fantastic piece, and I'm told this is developing into a book. Likewise, my brother Jimmy Adesina in the University of South Africa is doing a similar exercise. And so you like to see all the various tributes which really elaborate and expand on Thandika's intellectual history and its contribution to African scholarship. There is Ibrima Sal, former Executive Secretary of SADC, of Codestria, SADC. SADC is irrelevant here. The Mike Chege, Peter Anyang Nyongo, Zenta Desi, who worked with Thandika, Issa Shivji, Abdullah Batili, and many others. Nzongola and Talaja out there in the diaspora, and the many young scholars, including Elinor, who may not be so young, but she's one of our younger generation. She has done a good piece on Thandika on Facebook, but I'm sure she too will be asked to contribute. So enough will be said about Thandika's intellectual contribution, but I think I want to just highlight the second point, which is that Thandika's role in placing African scholars and African scholarship on the global map. This is often taken for granted now, 40 years after the founding of CODESRIA, the African Association of Political Science APS, and also SAPIS Trust, among other African institutions. Thandika was at the heart of that process, central to that process. As I do reflect in my tribute to Thandika, his own contribution to Zimbabwe, in the sense of the development of ZIDS, but more important, the book which we published in 1986, The Political Transition. And his preface, or his forward in that book, is very important. I cited at length that we, through CODESRIA, APS, and other organizations, but in particular CODESRIA and Thandika himself, there was the real challenge to the African studies industry in the North. Even people of my generation had to go to the African studies industries of the North to do our PhDs. And I would like to say that we changed this dramatically over the last 40 years. Elinor made reference to the reading lists in our universities. Even as external examiner at the University of Dar es Salaam many years later, I would fail lecturers who failed to reflect in the reading list African scholarship. In fact, by the mid-80s, it was no longer fashionable to be quoting or citing the works of Huntington and all those so-called gurus of Northern Hemisphere. If you didn't have Thandika Mkandawire, Samia Amin, Issa Shivji, Peter Anyang, and some such scholars, and also to mention South African scholars, some of whom were my own teachers, people like Achima Feje, Samuel Luchungu, Ben Magubani, and Molly Nkosi. Thandika helped to make African scholarship the thing. And through CODESRIA in particular, the General Assembly, which became almost a pilgrimage. If you're not there, you didn't matter as a scholar. So the contribution of Thandika to establishing African scholarship, the African intellectual community, cannot be exaggerated. Lastly, but not least, I said Thandika was an incorrigible Pan-Africanist. He believed in Africa. In particular, as Gilbert has indicated, it is Thandika who coined and developed the theory on the developmental state. The developmental state was at once a democratic and economic development-related state. The concept of the development state combines both democracy and economic development, neither prior to the other, to use the old Marxist thesis. These are electrically interlinked, and to try and decouple them is a fallacy. So here we learned through Thandika that you could not celebrate states which were said to be disdainful of democracy, but were successful economically. This was a big fad in those days. And through that, Thandika also interacted very actively with some of he made a clear distinction. He didn't generalize the African condition. He didn't generalize African failure. He made a distinction between progressive Africans and reactionary ones within the state and outside the state. And I remember we working with Thandika with such progressive nationals as Adedeji when he was at ECA, Bax Numvete. We sought to infuse progressive thinking into progressive nationalists and assist them in terms of trying to rescue the post-colonial state from its many vagaries, which are well known. So Thandika did never gave up. And if he left us anything, it was this belief that we can recover, that we can redeem the African condition, and that us Africans, we can do it, and that we must do it. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ibbo, for that input, and which I think people who know Thandika really you spoke directly to. And I think it was not only just African scholarship, he had a deep, deep love for African culture and African music. One of those strange coincidences that his death happened in the same week as Manu Dibango and a great African storyteller, Credo Mutwa. I'd like to, at this stage, invite the members of his family just to say a few things quickly. Maybe if we start with the elder, Pat Mahoney, and then followed by Joshua and any other family members who are here to give quick comments. And then after that, I would like to say something as an elder on this platform.
Thank you very much, Elena. I think on part of the family, I think, well, we just wish to thank the UJ Center of Africa for organizing the seminar and keeping the spirit of Thandika alive. And we're extremely humbled and grateful to you, the chairman, and the speakers for such wonderful work you're doing in keeping Thandika's legacy alive. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. And when you speak, I can't fail to think of Guy Mahoney. So very close to Thandika. We lost too soon. And I remember Thandika's devastation at that loss. Another African scholar we really want to see on the bibliographies of our university courses. So Joshua, can you comment? And then immediately after that, Nuruddin.
It's an honor for you guys to have put this together. And it's nice to hear such great things about my father. I myself, who mostly have been focusing on music and other kind of arts, I've recently started studying and sociology and music theory, and which has put me and my father in these last days, it would put us together, and it also gave me insight to what he's really doing. So it's just nice to hear these kind words and fine words about Mr. Thandika Mkandawire. I'm very pleased to be a part of this meeting as well.
It's great to meet you as an adult. You were the apple of your father's eye, and we knew you as a young person, many of us. So it's also good to see that you are going into music, which was a great love of your father's.
Mm.
We'll hear now from Nuruddin Farah, one of our foremost novelists in Africa, and who personally knew Thandika very well.
Well, Thandika was one of the things that I will always remember him for. Is that he thought about other people before he thought of himself. And he had a way of bringing the best out of everyone. He was intellectually exciting to be with because he could quote a German philosopher And then a few minutes later, we'd be talking about a Swedish soccer player. This was a man who had the world under his command. And also, in a personal sense, I'm very grateful to him that he had a hand in making it possible for Amina, Mama, and I to marry. And wherever you met him, to have developed in his commitment, especially in his commitment to Africa. Now, it was thanks to him that Codesphere was able to bring many, many African intellectuals together. And even though I am not in the social sciences, Thandika never hesitated to invite me to the meetings and encouraged me to become as well read in the social sciences as he was in philosophy and literature. And since there is a, I will miss him greatly and regret that I did not look him up when I was last in England or in Sweden. And I greet you all and share the condolence about Thandika, whom we all love. Thank you.
Thank you, Nuruddin. I remember meeting Thandika one time when he was on a visit to South Africa, and I asked him, how's Amina? Because I had met Amina Mama through him. And he very proudly said, she's marrying Nuruddin Farah, and I'm responsible for the introduction. So he was quite proud of that accolade. We have Chuarelo, I hope I pronounced that right, Chuarelo, who would like to say something.
Thank you very much. I just actually need to ask a question rather than make an input. And my question is, there's enough literature about decolonization that comes from Africa. But if you are to check the curriculum of our universities, it's lacking quite a lot in terms of the work of the scholars that you have dealt with. Now, my question is really, what could be done in practical terms to ensure that going forward, there is sufficient literature that is being taught, there is sufficient knowledge production that is African-centered within our institutions of higher learning? Thank you very much.
I can see Professor Gilbert there is itching to respond to that. Maybe you'd like to.
Thank you very much for that question. I think part of the weakness of the decolonization scholarship is that it's too much focused on Fanon and nobody else. So I challenge the scholarship on decolonization to broaden their horizon and incorporate scholars. I think of the stature of Thandika. The scholarship now is very narrowly based on a very few thinkers. Maybe Nkrumah here, maybe Fanon, but nothing else. So I think it's our responsibility, if we want to be credible decolonial scholars, to begin to look more seriously at the whole array of African scholarship. And I think that's a very good question that needs to be addressed. And as I mentioned from the outset, I have consistently used Mkandawire in my classes because to me, he spoke to a lot of the things that I thought my students would be interested in. How do we understand the African predicament? And I think he did that very cogently. And therefore, he's never been marginal to my work as a scholar who wants to understand Africa. So if we want to be serious about decolonization, we should broaden our horizon to be more inclusive.
Thank you for that. I think I would add that for South Africa, South African universities need to interrogate the relationship of South Africa to the rest of Africa. And it's not only bringing African scholars into our universities, their works, but also treating them better when they come here. And I remember when Thandika came to South Africa, one of the things he was asked in his application for residence or with the Department of Home Affairs was to give all the last places, 8 places he had worked, and which was quite a ridiculous request. And I think the thing about making it easier and welcoming African scholars is something which South Africans need to look seriously at, as well as the relationship to the rest of the continent and how Africans are treated here. I have a comment here from Lisa Laxo. Maybe Lisa, you might want to say something.
Thank you for invitation to this seminar, and thanks for everybody for the words. Greetings from the Nordic Africa Institute. Thandika, of course, was a very important supporter of the Institute and fellow. I think that last time I met him was June at the Institute when our former director Ina Soiri left. It was her farewell occasion, and Thandika was remembering the work he had done at the Institute, and remembering visitors who had been at the Institute during this year. So it was such a, we are still recovering of this news that he is not anymore with us. The Institute has the Institute has been there since 62. So during these years, Thandika has been one of the most important fellows. So thank you for this occasion to be able to take part. And as I wrote, when I was at the University of Helsinki, Thandika became an honorary doctor, and one of the honorary doctors at that time was also our former prime minister. So we had good time in Helsinki in 2011 when Thandika and Karina visited Helsinki. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that input from the North. And no one else has indicated on the chat. Please, maybe the next person just come up and speak and make your input.
And thank you very much for organizing this. Of course, it's a very difficult moment for many of us who are social scientists and who have known Thandika's works for a long while. In addition to the discussion that Gilbert and Ibbo have made on his works, I think let's not forget his influence in trying to provide theoretical approaches to understand Africa's predicament. In particular, in recent times, actually before he died, he was taking head-on discussions on your patrimonialism, again for the same reasons that Ibbo Mandaza has given here, that he did not like to generalize on Africa's context, and that's something he did not really like. And therefore, he faced the patrimonial discussions head-on, and trying to demonstrate that they were not theories, neither were they able to explain and predict Africa's circumstances. And they were just labels, and that's what Thandika said. I am personally touched because as a friend, we used to meet and talk regularly. In December, actually, we had a meeting here in Nairobi. We had a long conversation on him coming back to Nairobi at the Institute for Development Studies for a public lecture again, which we were organizing for him to come back in March. And way back in Copenhagen in the 90s, when asked about why are African intellectuals not having impact in the same manner as they did in the 60s and 70s. And his answer was very simple. Consultancy industry by most of the development agencies drained African intellectuals away from classroom and research to consultancy, and therefore there was no academic work there. And then the second point that he made, which was very, very significant, and I think Ibbo related to this a couple of years later, is the fact that the first generation of African leaders was supportive of university education. People like Nkrumah, people like Kenyatta, people like Nyerere were supportive of Africa's education simply because a majority of them were children of peasants. And therefore they related with higher education as a way of building knowledge and building the nation state in a fundamental way. And then he argued later on that the third generation of African leaders had no relationship with the peasantry, had no relationship with higher education. And it is that group of leaders that actually was tormenting, if I can use that word, tormenting Africa's intellectualism in a major way. By the time he died, he had told me he was trying to finish a manuscript that again was examining his, where he was looking at his passionate subject of Africa's development. And there is a chart we were discussing. One of the line graphs was actually about Africa's development from the 60s to present day, and why present day growth is not sustainable. Those are some of the issues that one can really say. There is a question that someone has asked about Africa's literature and why this literature is not in our curriculum or is not in our course references and so on. Now, we must admit as scholars also, accessibility of some of our works has been a major challenge. Ibbo Mandaza through SAPES did a very good job, if one can remember, in the 1990s. But as usual, the marketing and the distribution of what is produced by Africans here is a problem. And related to this is the whole question that we see with the outside scholars, and Lisa Lasso is my friend. I'm not talking about Lisa Lasso, but talking generally about scholars in the West who really use Africa as a scholarship, even if they come to Africa. Many of them, and I'm very serious about American scholarship and part of Western Europe in some instances. They have no, I mean, they will use African literature, but rarely will they use it, and there's a tendency of reproducing their works also in our classrooms. Let that not be the debate for now, but I think accessibility of Africa's research publications has been an issue of concern, and we may want to start thinking about how to rebuild that particular issue, address that one particular issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that input. And I'll call on Konji Sebati to this.
Hi, Elinor, thank you. Mine is a very light one, light-hearted one, really. I'm not a scholar like all of you amazing scholars on the call, but I recall when I first met Thandika in Geneva, where I was posted in Bern as the South Africa's ambassador, and we were at some lunch, and I was then introduced to him, and then he introduced his wife. And he said to me, you see that Mzungu woman there, that's my wife. And of course, I got very embarrassed and I kind of blushed, even with my color. And he said to me, so I said to him, that's not a nice thing to say about somebody. And he laughed heartily and said, young lady, you still get embarrassed by the truth. And that was my first encounter with Thandika. But of course, when I was in Bern, he was very supportive to my initiatives. When I wanted a speaker, he'd agreed to be there. And And one particular one that I remember is when he hosted the book launch of Bralu Nkosi, when he launched his book, Mandela's Ego. So yeah, he was a great support for me on that academic front when I was in Bern. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Konji. I think also one of the things about Thandika, we've talked about the serious scholar and his a very substantive contribution to African academic thought. But Thandika was also a very, he loved absurdity. He really reveled in the absurd and would recognize all sorts of strange things which no one else would. And I think that's something that sometimes, you could make humor out of a very, very serious situation. And I think, anybody who feels they want to comment on that part or the more personal part, please do so. Also, we are in a situation where there is a reassertion of national identities and an increasing chauvinism in the world, which is a danger to our existence as a global society. We're experiencing this thing of racism against Africans in China, and that's one of the things I miss Thandika for, because he would have probably had a very interesting analysis to make on that. So Thandika was a person who really had a Pan-African identity. He identified strongly as a Malawian. He loved his Zimbabwean roots. He related very well with Zambia. When Zambia won the African Nations Cup, he was, people from all over congratulated him. In Senegal, he was literally, we used to call him the mayor of Dakar, because people loved him. And I was just imagining when we heard this news, what it must be like in the streets of Dakar. So he was a very humorous person. You talked about when they bought the Codesria, it was a villa which was owned by some kind of Mauritanian sheikh. And he says, we inherited a slave, because slavery hadn't been outlawed in Mauritania, I think, until 1980. So this man was literally a slave. He says, so of course we tried to free him, and he didn't want to be free, he stayed on. So those are the kind of comments Thandika would make. And I think that light-hearted part of it, if anyone wants to speak to that, you're welcome to do so. I see that Yemi, I think Yemi Katerere is also on the call. Would you like to say something, Yemi?
Thank you very much, Elinor. I'm not from the social sciences. I'm a forester. And so I got to know Thandika both when he was in Senegal, as well as when he was at ZIDS, through the work that he was doing at ZIDS with Ibbo, Samoyo, and other scholars. And for me, it was an educational journey, as a forester, coming from a strong science background, how to bring in the social sciences into forestry. So the engagement with Thandika was, for me, also an educational journey, but also the discussion around structural adjustment, beginning to look at structural adjustment also from an environmental perspective, not just the economic and social dimensions of structural adjustment, but the environmental dimensions and the impacts that structural adjustment had because of the relationship between rural communities and nature and their dependency for their livelihoods on land and on natural resources. And so that was very powerful for me to be able to bring that into the forestry perspective. And then today, of course, coming into the whole issue of COVID-19 and the fact that we are in COVID-19 because of the relationship between nature and human activities, and how the virus was able to escape from animals into humans, and that we have not been able to pay attention to the fact that the developmental state is about democracy, but it's also about nature, and that nature underpins development within the African context. So Thandika was a friend, interacted with him in different ways, as I said, in Zimbabwe, in Senegal, as well as in Geneva. And Joshua, like you were saying, it's good to see Joshua as a grown individual. So met Joshua in different contexts as he was growing up. So I've enjoyed reading all the things that have been written about Thandika, and through that I've also gone to know different aspects of Thandika that I didn't know, and some of the things that you are saying, Elinor. And one of the most interesting pieces was written by his relative, describing his life in Zimbabwe and his parents, and how they moved from Zimbabwe to Malawi, and then from Malawi to Zambia, and then from Zambia to Malawi. So yeah, so my condolences to the family, and I'm really grateful that you've been able to put this together in order for us to remember a great person, and as it's been described, a giant of an intellectual. And I'm really privileged to have been associated with him. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Yemi. I wonder, David Monyaki, would you want to say something at this point? And then I'd like to ask Baso to come in to tell us how much time we have left.
Okay, thank you very much, Mrs. Sisulu. So Dr. Mnyai is unfortunately having some technical difficulties, and he has tasked me with giving the vote of thanks for this evening. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I think particularly from the point of view of young scholars, I think if it was not clear before, it's clear tonight that we have quite big shoes to fill, and the challenge is for us to pick up where the late great Professor Mkandawire left off, and to incorporate his thought and method into present-day realities all over the continent, in the varieties of countries that populate the continent, and to also incorporate his thought and method into the global issues which confront us, and the changing structure of the global economy in the wake of the COVID-19, in the wake also of what some are calling the fourth industrial revolution. I would, on behalf of the center, like to thank the family of the late great Professor Mkandawire, to also thank the speakers for this evening, Professor Khadiagala, Dr. Mandaza, and also my Elinor for chairing these proceedings. And I would also like to thank our strategic and important partners at the UJ Library for facilitating this platform in these challenging times. It's very important that we keep on interacting, and they've been quite stellar in facilitating these sorts of conferences. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, especially Dr. David Mnyai and Dr. Emmanuel Matambo, who wrote a very touching and analytical piece on the legacy of Professor Mkandawire. It's available online in the World News Chronicle website. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, we would like to thank all of you for participating and gracing this event and asking wonderful questions and your insightful comments. Have a good night, and we hope to stay in touch with all of you. Thank you very much.